We're ready to discuss proofs, which include two parts of discourse, the confirmation and the refutation. The confirmation being the positive, and the refutation answering your opponent's objections. Now, this is the meat of your discourse, so the arrangement here is very important. Everything prior to this, I already mentioned, everything prior to this is preparation for it. So you're setting the table, preparing your audience, preparing your audience to give you a hearing on your arguments. It should be very clear that this is where the meat of your presentation will be found. You've promised, up to this point, you've promised to deliver something, and you must make good on that promise. The Wilson said, the proofs are the place where the explicit arguments for the case are made, and which need to be arranged carefully. The proofs, as I mentioned, have two main components, the confirmation and the refutation. I know that we've discussed that a few times, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on it. The confirmation gives the positive proofs for your position. Those have to be strong. You can't just attack your opponent's position. You have to present a case yourself for your position being the right one. The refutation shows why your opponent is a lunatic or a liar or both. In the refutation, it is important that you anticipate and answer your opponent's objections to your case, and especially their rational objections. The irrational ones, not so important, but the rational ones you've got to deal with. So here are some advice for you in the area of proofs. Be thorough, but not exhaustive. Remember what Wilson said about copiousness. He said, always leave an audience wanting to hear more from you, not less. Part of this means clearly having more that you could say, if necessary. If you stop when you could go on, this will be evident to the listener. If you continue 10 minutes past the point when you ran out of things to say, this will be equally and painfully obvious. Finish early, not late. Stop unloading the truck while there's still stuff on it. Don't continue unloading when the truck has been empty for the last 10 minutes. You've all sat through sermons, lectures, and so on, speeches, where it was evident to you that the speaker ran out of things to say long before he stopped. Don't be that person. That being said, the next piece of advice has to do with the actual arrangement of your arguments. Make sure that you give careful attention to the order that you give your arguments. Let's just say that you have 7 arguments. 7 main arguments. If you have 7, don't flatter yourself to think that all 7 of those are powerful, Rocky Balboa type punches, that blows that you're landing to your opponent's position. Don't flatter yourself that way. Good boxers do a lot of punching, but they don't land many knockout blows. And the same thing, a good hitter in baseball isn't always swinging for the bleachers. He knows how to hit the ball. If he only knows how to hit a home run, he's not going to hit very much. I think that they said Babe Ruth had more strikeouts than he had home runs. And I believe that because he was always swinging for out of the park. Learn how to hit the ball. Get a hit. Get your bat on that ball. But that being said, you need to understand that your arguments will range from strong to weak. And you need to arrange your arguments so that each one is put in the position where it can do the most damage to your opponent and do the most good to make your case. That being said, you don't necessarily want to start with your strongest argument. unless your strongest argument is the most obvious or the most anticipated argument. So there is a place for that. When your audience expects you to make a certain argument, not disappointing them in that. All right? If your audience is already prepared with an answer to your strongest argument, and you know it, they've already answered it in their mind, you want to save it for later. Here's why. And this is the case no matter what. This is also why you don't want to start with your weakest argument. When you make an argument, if those who oppose your position or your viewpoint, if they have an answer ready and they find it very easy to answer that argument of yours, then they've already dismissed you. If your first argument you put up, they knock down, they swat it down like a fly, then they're not listening to you because they've already answered you. You're not persuading them anymore. So you want to start with the arguments that your opposition can't answer, or doesn't have a ready answer for, or doesn't have an easy answer for. Because the earlier they refute you in their mind, the earlier they dismiss you. So, once your argument is refuted, once your audience refutes your first argument, they won't listen anymore. That brings up a related point. And I already said it, but never start with your weakest arguments. Never. In fact, as a rule, don't use weak arguments at all. If you do, if you have, like I said, 7 arguments, 3 of which are pretty weak, they wouldn't work well by themselves for sure. But you want to use them. Sometimes it can be effective just to give the impression that you have an overwhelming case. You have a lot of arguments to make your case. Then what you do with those arguments is to group them together in the middle of your speech. Sort of like, again, to use a battle metaphor, you've got your heavy artillery from the back and it's launching into the battlefield, and you've got your really potent forces moving in from the edges, but you put machine guns in the middle to provide kind of cover fire across the battle and try to keep your opponents pinned down. If you look at those weak arguments, kind of like machine gun fire, one single bullet by itself isn't going to do much. But if you can spray the ground with it and keep your enemies down and pinned to the ground, then it is effective. Quintilian said, they may not have the overwhelming force of a thunderbolt, but they will have all the destructive force of hail. One strategy that you can use, and again, we're presenting you with strategies. We're not presenting you with formulas. So you look at your arguments and you decide where they fit best, where they'll do the most for your cause and the most damage to your opponent's cause. One strategy is to alternate between strong and weak arguments, where the strong arguments are elaborated and the weak arguments are mentioned and then passed over. And what you're saying there, you mention it, you don't dwell on it, but your audience gets the impression that there's a lot more that you could say about this. So, you don't start with your strongest argument necessarily. Definitely don't start with weak arguments. But also don't end with weak arguments. Here's why. If your last argument is a weak argument, that will be the last thing your audience remembers. And they'll walk away believing that you don't have a very strong case because you ended with that. Again, to use a boxing metaphor, they tell me that boxers save their best punches for the beginning and end of the round. That's because boxers are boxing for the judges. And the judges will decide And it's subjective in some cases, but they'll decide who won the round or not. Now, they have a punch count, a hit count, and it depends on the technicality of it. I think the Olympics are a little bit more objective and technical, although I've seen some cases where that wasn't the case at all. But the judge ultimately makes a subjective decision of who won the round. And that's where you get split decisions and so on. So the boxer boxes for the judges. He starts well, and he wants to end better than he started. He wants the end of the round. He wants to be punching harder, faster, landing more, a flurry of attack before the bell rings. And to follow that similarly, if you want some punch, if you want argument with punch, then you've got to use those weak arguments strategically. Group them in the middle. Don't use them at the beginning. Don't use them at the end. It is best to arrange your arguments by strength. You can start with either your strongest argument or your second strongest argument. Now, I said earlier not to start with your strongest, and that's because if it's possible, it's best to make your strongest argument, put your strongest argument at the very end of your discourse, or at the end of your proofs, I should say. So here are a couple of possibilities. If, say, you have 5 arguments, and if you rank those arguments in order of strength, you start with your second strongest, then your third, your fourth, your fifth, and you end with your first. Now, I know that sounds like, well, you said to put the weak arguments in the middle, but 3, 4, and 5 are sandwiched by 2 and 1. So they're in the middle, and you're beginning with a powerful argument. Most of the time, your second strongest argument is going to be pretty close in strength to your first argument. But that first argument, your strongest one, is the one you leave. It's the last nail in the coffin. It nails that coffin down. You could also start with your strongest and go in this order of strength. 1, 3, 4, 5, 2. Again, you have to look at your arguments. You have to know the strength of those arguments and what will work. Again, there may be very slight difference in the strengths of your first and second arguments. So put them at the beginning and end, and also decide based on what the audience's expectation might be, or what might be stronger with a particular argument, or a particular audience, or make that audience more friendly to your case, and so on. Now, we're speaking there of the positive proofs, the confirmatio, the refutatio. In your refutation, you want to attack your opponent's strongest arguments first. But there is a disclaimer on that. You only attack your opponent's strongest argument first if you have a powerful refutation for it. If you don't, be careful. Either ignore their strongest argument or save your answer for the end. In general, though, you should go after their weakest points, especially if they've emphasized those weaker points. If they made a point of it and it's easily refuted, or you have a good refutation for it, do that right away. Whatever argument that they've made, that they've emphasized, that you have a good answer for, one that will stick with your audience. And, by the way, a humorous answer. If it gets the audience to laugh, that's the most powerful of refutations. You should have something to say about every argument they make, and not anything positive. You don't, especially if it's their strongest argument, you shouldn't say, well, I have to admit that they're right about that. Not that, again, you're not tricking and fooling, okay? If you're changing your mind in the middle of the debate, but that's in a debate. When you're speaking, and they have a really strong argument in answer to yours, or you anticipate that there's a really strong objection, or you've encountered strong objections to your case, and you don't have an answer for their strongest objection, you still, if you don't mention it, if you just ignore it, even though I said earlier to just ignore it, if you just ignore it, understand that that undermines your case, especially if you have an informed audience. It's best to say something. Show why it's wrong. Show why it doesn't really make their case, or why it could be used to make your case as well. Why that argument is a strong argument, but it also could be used to argue what I'm arguing for in this case as well. The last part of discourse is the conclusion. The Latin word for conclusion is the peroratio. That's an interesting word. Peroratio is synonymous with the entire speech or discourse. It literally means speech or discourse. And it's meant, and really it points to the purpose of the conclusion. The conclusion is there to give a summary of everything that you've said. So you're going to take your entire case. You've made a 15-minute speech. 12 of those 15 minutes has passed. You're in the conclusion. The last 3 minutes, what are you going to do? Well, in those 3 minutes, you're going to encapsulate everything that you've said up to this point. All right? You're going to summarize. Cicero recommended 3 things for the conclusion. Number 1, sum up your arguments. Number 2, cast your opponents in a negative light. Number 3, arouse sympathy for yourself, for your client, or for the case. Okay, so those 3 things, again, sum up your arguments, cast your opponents in a negative light, and arouse sympathy for yourself, your case, or your client. Your summary should review all the issues very briefly and remind the audience of how each of your points was supported. But be careful here. You don't want to just sound like you're repeating yourself. Remember that simple outline we gave a while ago for a good speech. Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. Okay? In that last part, the conclusion, telling them what you told them, put some art into it. You want it to be artistic rather than argumentative. Remember this rule, the rule of rhetoric, the rule of art. 'Tis art to conceal art. You don't want your audience to say, oh yeah, he used that technique. You don't want the technique you use to be evident in what you say. So you want to be artistic in how you do this. In other words, think of a creative way to review your case and represent your material. Your summary should review all the issues briefly and remind the audience how each was supported. Okay? But this, again, can't just be done in a wooden kind of clunky way. You want it to make your argument shine. You also want to save emotional appeals for this time. This is a time to enhance your own ethos, to leave your audience with a favorable impression of yourself. And in doing so, try to get your audience to identify with you or with your position. The more that they identify with you or your position, the more likely you are to have persuaded them. Let me give you a final word, and we'll be finished with this lecture. The ancients considered arrangement to be one of the most important elements of discourse. You have the 5 canons that we reviewed at the beginning: invention, arrangement, style, memory, delivery. They considered arrangement to be right up there with invention as one of the most important of the canons. Now there's a reason for this. Great content can easily be clouded by poor arrangement. And when a speaker or a writer gives no attention to arrangement, or arranges poorly, the audience will often be confused by what is being said. John Broadus, again in his book, said the speaker who neglects arrangement will rapidly lose, instead of improving, his power of constructing, organizing a discourse. The goal then is to be clear. Present clear thoughts in a proper order. Again, let me quote Broadus. It is melancholy to think how large a portion of the people, even in favored communities, really do not understand most of the preaching they hear. Now, I know that you're not preaching, but I want you to think, though, how many times you listen to a speaker and don't have any idea what they're saying. All right? Take the time to arrange your material in a logical order that will enhance your speech and give your audience the best chance to understand what you're arguing. That's it.